It hurts when I sit down. Teacher calls the police after hearing this from a 6-year-old girl. The first thing Daniel noticed was the silence. It was Tuesday, 7:40 a.m. The classroom should have been buzzing with kids' chatter, giggles, and hurried footsteps. But that morning there was quiet, not complete silence. Children still spoke, but something felt suspended, as if the air itself had changed density. That's when he saw her. Isadora was standing in the doorway with her backpack still on. Her face was partly hidden by light brown hair, her big eyes fixed on the floor. She wasn't the kind of girl who drew attention. Quiet, polite, always very reserved. But at that moment, her whole body was screaming without a sound. Daniel approached slowly, guided by instincts only years in a classroom can train. "Hey, Isa, you okay?" She took her time answering. She tilted her head to the side, then down. Finally, she murmured so softly he had to lean in to hear, "I can't sit, it hurts." Daniel froze. For a second he thought he'd misheard. "What do you mean it hurts? What happened?" She didn't answer. She took a step back as if she feared he'd try to touch her. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands clenched together, and there was something in her eyes, not just physical pain. It was fear, an old, deep-rooted fear. Daniel felt his stomach twist. "Isa, did you get hurt? Did you fall? Do you want to show me?" She shook her head, her gaze still locked on the floor. I just can't sit. It hurts," she repeated, her voice now trembling. The other kids started to notice. Murmurs arose. Daniel motioned for them to sit down, then led Isadora to her desk without forcing anything. He grabbed a cushion from the reading corner and placed it on her chair. "You can stand if you want, or use the cushion. Is that okay?" She nodded, tears held back behind her eyes, but she didn't sit. She didn't touch the cushion. All morning, Isadora stayed standing beside her chair. She wrote, she drew, she participated when called on. But her posture never relaxed. Every time a child laughed too loudly or the door banged, she visibly flinched. Daniel watched everything, growing more unsettled by the minute. At recess, when the other kids ran out to the playground, he gently called her over. "Isa, can I talk to you for a minute?" She hesitated, but she stayed. "Did someone hurt you?" Her eyes went wide. Then the tears came, silent, heavy. She still didn't speak. She just bit her lower lip until it was almost sore. Daniel felt his heart break. At the end of the day, he went to the principal's office, Mrs. Tanya's, and explained the situation. "She can't sit down. She's terrified. It seems like real pain, and she won't talk about what happened." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "Kids make things up sometimes, Daniel. It could be a tantrum, or maybe she's imitating something she saw on TV. Do you really think a 6-year-old would invent pain just to avoid sitting?" "I'm saying don't jump to conclusions." Daniel ignored her condescending tone and called the local police. He requested a welfare check and reported what had happened. 2 hours later, 2 officers showed up, one bored-looking man and a woman who seemed slightly more empathetic. They listened to the account, spoke briefly with Isadora, who only repeated, "I can't sit, it hurts." With no visible injuries and no formal complaint, the two exchanged glances and sighed. "Unfortunately, without concrete signs of abuse, we can't take action. But we'll file a report," said the officer before leaving. Daniel stood in the empty hallway, feeling a corrosive mix of powerlessness and anger. Deep down, he knew something was very wrong. He knew. He didn't need marks on her body to recognize the terror in a child's eyes. That night at home, Daniel was grading papers when he saw Isadora's drawing. It was simple, done in colored pencils, a chair, small and centered on the page. Around it were red splotches, not flowers, not hearts. They were splatters, stains. He held the paper for a long time. The girl's silence now had a shape. It had a color. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and made a decision. Even if no one else believed her, he would. And that would change everything. Isadora returned to school the next day. She was still silent, tense, and still refused to sit. The cushion was there, untouched. Every gesture of hers seemed calculated, as if she lived in constant alert. Daniel watched everything with extra care. He spoke with Leticia, the school psychologist. When she saw the drawing of the chair surrounded by red splotches, she felt the same unease. They decided to act cautiously. Leticia began offering the girls small symbolic activities: free drawing, storytelling with open endings, pretend play games where the children invented characters and situations. It was a way to create space for Isadora to speak without being asked directly. In the first days, nothing changed. But gradually she began to express herself, not with words, but with gestures and images. Her drawings spoke more than her sentences. Houses without windows, black clouds, faceless dolls. Daniel sank deeper into his unease. Something inside him had already snapped. He could no longer live with the silence, pretending it was normal. He conducted discreet inquiries. He asked the office about Isadora's family. He discovered she had an older brother, Nilo, 12 years old, enrolled in the same school district, but who hadn't shown up for months. No excuses, no return. One late afternoon, after hours of reflection, Daniel went to their neighborhood. It was a run-down housing project with narrow, poorly lit corridors. He climbed worn stairs, guided only by the address in the school records. He knocked on the door, his heart racing. A thin boy with sunken eyes and an exhausted expression answered. "Nilo?" Daniel asked. The boy nodded. His voice was barely audible when he spoke. "Is Isa okay?" Daniel assured him she was. He explained he was her teacher and just wanted to understand a bit more. Nilo didn't invite him in. He stood in the doorway, looking back frequently, as if afraid of being overheard. After a few minutes of silence, he spoke. "He hits her when he's angry, and when he's not, too. Sometimes, out of nowhere, with a belt." Daniel swallowed hard. "And your mother?" "She does nothing. She stays quiet, says it's worse if she tries to stop him." Nilo seemed too grown up for his age. He shouldered responsibilities no child should know, taking care of the house, his sister, the meals. He no longer went to school. He had left his own childhood behind, but it was one phrase Daniel would never forget. "If we tell, my mom will leave forever." There was fear there, but also love, twisted by guilt, by dependency, by unending terror. Daniel thanked him, promising that Isadora was being protected. He left with shaky legs. He couldn't return to routine after that. What he had heard no longer fit inside him. The next day, he shared everything with Leticia. She already had records of the girl's behavior, her drawings, her body language. Together, they decided to start documenting everything with care, discretion, and rigor. Leticia suggested that instead of pressing Isadora with questions, they create a space where she could speak on her own terms. They made a secret teacher notebox where the children could write or draw messages, an apparently playful activity, but one that offered freedom for spontaneous expression. On the first day, nothing. On the second, a meaningless scribble. On the third, a simple drawing, a face with crying eyes and a mouth sealed with an X. Daniel looked at it and understood. The girl was beginning to speak, in her own way, and most importantly, she was beginning to trust. In the days that followed, the notes left by Isadora took shape. Some were still scribbles. Others contained short, disconnected phrases brimming with feeling. "He yells at night. I have to stay still. Quiet or it hurts." With each word, Daniel and Leticia felt the puzzle coming together piece by piece, and the picture was disturbing. Isadora still didn't speak directly about what was happening, but it was no longer just silence. Her drawings, her hesitant words, The way she shrank from any touch, all pointed to the same place. The pain was no longer just physical, it was fear installed like furniture inside her. Letitia, with her usual care, maintained the approach. No invasions, no direct questioning. Just space, acceptance, and patience. It was during an ordinary afternoon, while the children drew in silence, that it happened. Isadora scribbled in concentration. Letitia approached slowly, sat beside her, saying nothing. They stayed like that for several minutes. Then, unprompted, Isadora began to speak. "When he yells, the floor shakes," she said without looking up. "But when he's quiet, it's worse." Letitia didn't react with surprise. She just listened. She took her cell phone out of her pocket, placed it beside her, unnoticed by the girl, and recorded what came next. "The belt is when I make a mistake, or when I don't. It's when he wants. Sometimes he doesn't say anything, he just comes. Mummy says don't cry out loud, because it's harder for her too." It was only a few intense minutes. Then Isadora put down her pencil and returned to silence, as if she'd exhaled something that wouldn't fit inside her anymore. Letitia saved the audio and looked at Daniel, who watched from the doorway. They knew they had just received something very close to a plea for help. With the recording and the previous documentation, Daniel went straight to the Child Protection Agency. He presented the materials with urgency and hoped at minimum that something would be done. But across the table, he heard what he feared most. It was still not enough. A child's voice with no witnesses or visible injuries wasn't sufficient for legal intervention. They could monitor, initiate follow-up, but no immediate action would be taken. Daniel left feeling stifled. The frustration was so intense he could barely speak. How could they hear all that and still not act? How many more times would that child need to say it hurt? 2 days later, the answer arrived on its own. Isadora came to school walking slowly, as if each step were a wound. She wore long pants, despite the heat. She avoided looking at anyone. When Letitia approached her, she saw that her walk was even tensely rigid. With the gentle help of a nurse's aide, they managed to convince her to lift part of her shirt. The marks were there, pink and fresh in the shape of stripes. That was what they needed. This time, there was no discussion. Letitia and Daniel urgently called the Guardianship Council. The police were alerted. That very night, Isadora was taken from the house and placed in a shelter with specialized protection. Daniel followed it all from a distance. He watched the car drive away with the girl in the back seat, clutching her backpack like a shield. The relief of seeing her protected came with a new pain. What had she endured up to that point for someone to only now truly hear her? The next morning, Isadora's desk was empty. But for the first time, Daniel knew that was good news. She was no longer alone. Isadora's absence from school became a different kind of silence, not the silence of fear, but a void that left its own marks. The empty desk seemed like a constant reminder of the pain that had been hidden there for so long. In those first days, Daniel felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief knowing Isadora was safe, and guilt for taking so long to understand the signs. No matter how much he'd done, it felt so little compared to what she'd endured. Letitia, more composed, would remind him, "You listened when no one else would." But the weight didn't lift. School life carried on, yet something remained out of place. Daniel tried to visit Isadora at the shelter, but was advised to wait for the right time. She needed to adjust. She needed to learn she was safe now. Meanwhile, another worry grew. No one came to pick her up. Not her stepfather, not her mother. The police checked her home but found locked doors and silent neighbors. In a few days, the picture became clear. Marina, her mother, had vanished too. The obvious suspicion, she'd run away, probably with Elias. The confirmation hit Daniel like a blow. They'd rescued Isadora from her abuser, only for her to face something crueler still: abandonment. The pain in her body was beginning to give way to the question he knew she wouldn't voice aloud. Did my mom leave me? The following week, Daniel got permission for a visit. He found Isadora in the shelter's playroom, in a room with high windows and overly neat toys. She neither cried nor smiled, just looked at him as if waiting for an answer. Her first question was blunt. She chose him again? Daniel couldn't answer right away. He squeezed his eyes shut to hold back emotion. We're still looking for her, but you're safe now, and I'm not going anywhere, okay? Isadora simply nodded, as if she didn't know what to believe anymore. Back at school, Daniel tried to carry on, but felt disconnected. Lessons went on, kids laughed, tests were handed out, but everything felt grey. Then, one morning, an unmarked envelope appeared on his desk. Inside was a letter, handwritten in haste, from Marina. She wrote she was in hiding, terrified, that Elias had been threatening her for months, that she'd tried to run away but didn't know how. She'd seen her daughter whisked away at school and wanted to run there, but didn't have the courage. She never intended to abandon her children, but feared that if she spoke out, she would die. At the bottom, she left an address, a place where she was hiding, and a plea. I don't know what else to do, but if you still believe I can protect my daughter, please help me. Daniel read that letter over and over. The anger he felt toward her for disappearing began to dissolve, replaced by understanding. Marina too was a victim, lost, terrified. But now she'd taken the first step. Without hesitation, Daniel alerted the police. It was a chance to close the loop, to turn abandonment into reunion, to protect not only Isadora, but her mother too, if Marina was truly ready to change. That night, Daniel went to bed with the envelope on his desk. For the first time in weeks, he felt this story could still have a different ending, and this time, he wouldn't let anyone silence that little girl again. Marina's letter was enough to set things in motion. That very day, the police went to the address she'd given, a back room in an abandoned house on the edge of the neighborhood. They found Marina there, frightened, with dark circles under her eyes, visibly broken. When she saw them, she didn't run. She just cried. For the first time, she looked relieved to be found. Her testimony came in stages but was clear. She had lived under constant threat. Elias controlled her, warning that if she spoke out, she'd lose her children, that he'd do worse to them. Marina confessed that in recent weeks she'd spent her days locked up, too afraid he'd catch on to her plan to escape. She didn't absolve herself. She lowered her eyes and said fear had paralyzed her, and that the moment she saw her daughter taken, she knew she had to act. Writing the letter was all the courage she could muster. Her statement bolstered the case Daniel and Leticia had been carefully building. Now they had direct proof, context, and history. Acting swiftly, the police located and arrested Elias in the act. He tried to resist, but there was no way out. Inside his home, they found the belt, still marked, and the children's belongings hidden in a locked closet. Marina gave a new statement under legal protection. She was shaken, but for the first time, ready to face everything. At the shelter, Isadora learned of her stepfather's arrest. She didn't react with instant relief. She sat quietly for long moments, then asked, "He can't come back, right?" The social worker assured her he couldn't. Isadora simply nodded, staring at the floor as if still half expecting his shout from behind a door. The next day, Daniel was allowed another visit. The difference was in the details. She walked more lightly. Her backpack was no longer a shield. Her eyes, though still watchful, bore less weight than before. During his visit, she asked for drawing supplies. She picked up the colored pencils and made something simple, herself and Nilo holding hands, looking up at the sky. It was the first time she drew without any sign of pain or red blotches, just blue sky and steady feet on the ground. Daniel could barely speak. He just smiled, tears in his eyes. Later, Nilo was brought to the shelter to reunite with her. Their hug was silent but intense, as if they recognized each other for the first time outside the House of Fear. Marina, now under protection, began attending therapy sessions and preliminary hearings. She promised she would do whatever it took to keep her children, this time for real. When Isadora heard that, she replied with just one sentence. "I still don't know if I can come home." No one forced her to decide. It was the beginning of rebuilding. And after so much silence, for the first time, Isadora had the space to say what she felt and to be heard. The day of the hearing arrived like a heavy cloud on the horizon. Isadora had been prepared with as much care as possible. Leticia stood by her side every step of the way, respecting the girl's pace, reinforcing that she only needed to tell what she remembered and how she felt. Nothing more. No one would force her into anything. She'd already done the hardest part, surviving. The courtroom was set up specially for her testimony. There was no audience seating, no direct contact with the defendants. Isadora would speak from a private room with a psychologist's support and a judge trained in child testimony. At the door, Isadora gripped a colored pencil, a simple object, but in her hand it was like a talisman. She sat down slowly, looked around, took a deep breath, and waited. When the judge asked her to tell what she remembered, there was a moment of hesitation. Then in a low but steady voice, Isadora began. He would shout almost every day, but when he wasn't shouting, I was even more afraid, because that's how it would start. The silence was worse. Her words didn't seem rehearsed. They came raw and honest, carrying the weight only a child can bear, without fully understanding why. She spoke of the punishments, the nights she pretended to be asleep so she wouldn't be seen, the times the belt appeared even when I hadn't done anything. She told how her mother would cry in the bathroom but do nothing, how her brother tried to protect her but was too small himself. Then, staring at the pencil in her hand, she said, "I was scared even when everything was calm, because fear never sleeps." The courtroom fell silent. Next, the judge asked if she wanted to go back to live with her mother. There was a long pause. Isadora didn't cry. She simply answered with a maturity beyond her years. "I still love Mommy, but not yet. I can't go back yet." Marina, watching from another room, cried quietly. She didn't protest or beg. She just listened and understood. Based on all the accounts, the records from Daniel and Leticia, the notes, the drawings, Leticia's audio recording, Marina's testimony, and now Isadora's clear, brave words, the court issued its verdict. Elias was found guilty of serious bodily harm, abuse, coercion, and threats. He was sentenced to prison and legally forbidden from any future contact with Isadora or Nilo. Isadora would remain under institutional protection with ongoing psychological support and supervised visits from her mother, as determined by the specialists. The priority now was to rebuild bonds safely, only if that was what the child wanted. At the end of the day, Daniel went to see her at the shelter. He brought fresh colored pencils and a star-covered notebook. Isadora opened it, drew a house with big windows, and wrote, letters crooked but legible, "Now it's my turn to choose who comes in." Daniel almost couldn't speak. He just smiled, eyes brimming with tears. Later, Nilo was brought to the shelter to reunite with her. Their hug was silent but intense, as if they recognized each other for the first time outside the House of Fear. Marina, now under protection, began attending therapy sessions and preliminary hearings. She vowed to do whatever it took to keep her children, for real this time. When Isadora heard this, she replied with just one sentence, "I still don't know if I can go home." No one forced her to decide. It was the start of rebuilding. And after so much silence, for the first time, Isadora had room to say what she felt and to be heard. Months passed under the weight of a slow transformation. Isadora remained at the shelter, but her gaze was different. It was no longer the look of a child asking permission even to exist. It was the look of someone beginning to understand she could breathe without fear. Visits with her mother took place under supervision. Short, cautious, but important. Marina stayed committed to the process. She listened more than she spoke. She didn't demand her daughter back. She just showed with her eyes that she never wanted to lose her again. Nilo, in a separate foster unit, also received support. Gradually, the siblings were reunited. They hugged with the intensity of two people who know their time together was never guaranteed. Isadora no longer drew chairs, or belts, or crying eyes. Her drawings now featured trees, windows, and a timid sun peeking through clouds. Then, on a clear November morning, Isadora returned to school. Daniel already knew she was coming. He had prepared everything carefully. No fanfare, no party, just the space for her to own that return. The class was seated when she walked in, carrying a new backpack, a side braid, and a notebook clutched to her chest. She walked slowly to her old desk and stopped in front of it. This was the same spot where, months before, she had said, "I can't sit. It hurts." Now she looked at the chair with different eyes, not with fear, but with defiance, as someone facing something that once hurt her but no longer defines her. Isadora pulled out the chair. She sat down. She paused for a few seconds, then turned to Daniel, who watched quietly from the back of the room and said without effort, "Today, it doesn't hurt anymore." That was it. But it was everything. Daniel didn't reply. He just nodded, a soft smile on his lips and tears in his eyes. Because in that moment, he understood what had truly happened. The girl who once trembled at the sound of footsteps now walked on her own. The child who only knew how to stay silent now knew how to protect herself. Isadora still carried scars, but she no longer lived under them. Now, she chose what to keep, what to forget, and what to transform. And she transformed with a pencil, with a silence turned to words, with a chair that once hurt, and now was just a chair again. Isadora's story isn't about tragedy. It's about listening, about persistence, about what happens when an adult refuses to turn away. And, in the end, it's about what every child deserves, a real chance to grow up without fear. How many Isadoras do you think are still in silence? Type just "I listen" in the comments and show that you too won't look away. If this video moved you, leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach where it matters most.